Welcome. My name is Allison Frazier, and I'm the Managing Director of Policy and Research at the Charles Koch Institute. And on behalf of everybody at the Institute, I'd like to welcome you today to our discussion on grand strategy. And following the panel, we hope that you will continue the discussion and join us for lunch in this room. The Charles Koch Institute is a 501c3 educational organization, and we have nearly 3,000 alumni here in DC and across the country of our educational programs. This event is part of a broader effort by the Charles Koch Institute to directly engage in national conversations on this and other important issues. And so as such, this event is the first in a series on grand strategy. And we'd like to invite and encourage you to visit our website at thecharleskochinstitute.org and our sister organization, charleskochfoundation.org, for more about our work. So today's conversation, as you can tell by your programs, is an era of intervention. Is our grand strategy making us safer? Our moderator today is Paul Saunders. Paul is the Executive Director of the Center for the National Interest and also Associate Publisher of the Center's magazine, The National Interest. And for more on him and all of our panelists, you can see that in the program. Let's get this party started. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Allison, and thank you to the Charles Koch Institute for inviting me to moderate today. I'll try to be very brief. I don't think the panel really needs a lot of setup or extensive introduction from me. You have the bios also in the programs that you have, but I think we've got an excellent group today. Eugene Goltz on my far left, an associate professor of public affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs. Also with some experience a couple of years ago as a senior advisor in the Pentagon. Which, as someone who also spent a short time in government, I can say that it was very useful for me. I'm sure it was very useful for you in helping to understand how our policy process works. To his right, Will Ruger, who, of course, is Vice President of the Charles Koch Institute and the Charles Koch Foundation, and also an academic, previously an associate professor at Texas State University, and with the BA from William and Mary, which I really need to talk to you about because I have a 17-year-old son and also live in Virginia. And then finally, to my immediate left, Stephen Walt, professor of international affairs at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and the Robert and Renee Belfer Professor of International Affairs there, and of course a very distinguished academic with a number of high-profile books and other articles. So let's get started. I have been directed to give each of our speakers about 7 or 8 minutes. After the 3 of them finish, we will have a short, moderated discussion among the 3 of us, and then we'll open it up to questions from the floor with a view to finishing actually by noon. So I will be in charge of the trains running on time, and I've got my stopwatch right here. So Eugene, please. Or did we, sorry, oh, Steve, sorry. I had the wrong order. So reverse order.
Okay. The central purpose of any government policy should be to make the American people safer or more prosperous, or to strengthen key U.S. values. So when we're evaluating American grand strategy, the question to ask is a very simple one. Is it making us safer? Is it making us richer? Or is it advancing the cause of liberty? Since the end of the Cold War, both Republicans and Democrats have united around a very ambitious interventionist grand strategy of liberal hegemony. It calls for the United States to maintain overwhelming military supremacy, to use all the instruments of American power to spread democracy wherever possible, to extend security commitments to distant lands, even if they're of little strategic value, and to pressure, isolate, contain, or overthrow governments we don't like. There are some disagreements between, say, neoconservatives and liberal interventionists on this, but they all agree on those basic principles. Now, this strategy is very flattering to the American ego, our sense of moral superiority, but it has been a near total failure. It has not made us safer. It has not made us richer. It has not advanced the cause of freedom. And to see this clearly, all you need to do is consider where the United States and the world was back in, say, 1992, and see where it is today. If you do, you will see the opportunities we missed and the self-inflicted wounds we've endured. In fact, I would argue no foreign enemy has done as much damage to the United States as we have done to ourselves, whether in the form of foolish wars, ill-fated interventions, or the financial crisis of 2008. Back in '92, we had no serious rivals. We were actually on pretty good terms with all of the world's major powers, including China and Russia. Our only enemies were a bunch of weak and marginal rogue states like Serbia, Iraq, Libya. The Oslo Accords held out the promise of a Middle East peace. Saddam Hussein was disarmed, isolated, and contained. Iran had exactly 0 nuclear centrifuges operating. Hardly anybody had heard of al-Qaeda. Democracy was spreading in Eastern Europe and Latin America. The American defense budget was shrinking, and the United States is widely seen as a model for other countries to emulate. Lots of smart people thinking we'd reached the end of history and that the Washington consensus on democracy, markets, and the rule of law was really the only workable way to proceed. Now, the world we face today. Relations with Russia worse than at any time since the end of the Cold War. Repeated efforts to broker an Israeli-Palestinian peace have all been bungled. Al-Qaeda attacks us on 9/11, not because they hate our freedoms, but because they were violently opposed to much of American Middle East policy. We respond by invading Afghanistan and then Iraq. We fail to win either contest at a cost of several $1 trillion and 40,000 Americans killed or wounded, not to mention the losses suffered by people in the region. And of course, this expands Iranian influence there and eventually leads to the emergence of ISIS. After 10+ years of sanctions and threats, Iran now has 11,000 centrifuges operating and will end up with a latent nuclear capability. North Korea, India, and Pakistan all test nuclear weapons in this period. No successful multilateral trade deals at any point. The American intelligence community going rogue, engaging in torture and illegal surveillance and lying about it repeatedly. And then, of course, there's that little financial hiccup in 2008, another self-inflicted wound which cost between $6 and $14 trillion, according to the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. Democracy here and elsewhere not working particularly well. And in the meantime, China has continued to grow, increase its power, expand its territorial claims, and create new financial institutions that will eventually challenge American preeminence in the world economy. Now, I could go on for a while, but you get the idea. My basic point is you could point to a few minor successes here, but the strategy of liberal hegemony has not made us safer, not made us richer, and not succeeded in expanding core American values. This depressing record is not due to a run of bad luck or the clever stratagems of a powerful and cunning adversary. The problem is that the basic strategy was flawed. It was doomed to fail regardless of how it had been pursued. And let me close by just briefly enumerating the main failings of this grand strategy. First, endlessly expanding U.S. security commitments gives us more places to protect but doesn't provide more resources to do the job. So expanding NATO to include lots of weak Eastern European states meant providing guarantees to states right next to Russia who had very little military capacity themselves. It was a hollow pledge, and it also poisoned our relationship with Moscow. Dual containment in the Persian Gulf meant committing ourselves to containing Iraq and Iran simultaneously instead of using each to check the other. Second, liberal hegemony requires the frequent use of American military power, which inevitably produces a powerful backlash. Our military presence in the Middle East after 1992 led to the emergence of al-Qaeda and eventually to 9/11, which then leads us into Afghanistan and Iraq. Regime change in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and elsewhere either forces us to become an occupying power or creates a failed state causing much human suffering and creating breeding grounds for extremism. The key lesson here is that military power is a crude instrument, and inevitably it generates lots of unintended consequences. Third, threatening other countries with regime change encourages them to find ways to counter us and in ways we don't like. And whether or not it's the color revolutions in the former Soviet Empire that alarms them and leads to the situation we faced in Ukraine, or the fear of regime change that leads countries like Iran to pursue some sort of latent nuclear capability as well. Fourth, American dominance allows our allies to free ride so that we bear a disproportionate share of global security burdens. American protection also encourages some of our allies to do things we don't want because they know we'll come to their aid if they get into trouble. And over the past 20 years, key American allies have become either weaker or more irresponsible, or both. Finally, as opposition to the United States increases, we begin to see threats everywhere, and so we start compromising civil liberties here at home. Fewer people see us as a shining city to emulate. Instead, our use of torture and targeted killings and excessive surveillance becomes a precedent that others can and will emulate. Since 2005, in fact, democracy and human rights performance around the world have been eroding, not advancing. So trying to expand the realm of liberty at the point of a gun has failed as well. My last point, wandering all over the world and interfering in distant lands that we don't understand very well is expensive. We have enormous needs here at home, eroding infrastructure, troubled cities, subpar schools, and fixing those things will cost money. Now, I'm a big fan of a strong defense, but the national security establishment has adopted a strategy that keeps it very busy and gives it a large claim on our resources, but that strategy is not delivering the promised results. Instead of making us safer, richer, and stronger, it's doing the exact opposite. The American people understand this, by the way, which is why more than 80% now think the president should focus on domestic policy rather than foreign policy, and that percentage is up from 40% in 2007, now 80%. Americans, in other words, get this, even if our foreign policy establishment doesn't. This is not an argument for isolationism. The United States should stay diplomatically engaged, should trade and invest abroad, and it should stand ready to meet direct threats to vital American interests. But it should stop trying to run the world, stop trying to remake the world in its image, and stop believing that the whole planet is a nail that needs constant pounding by the mighty American hammer. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Steve. Well,
so Steve has nicely laid out many of the problems with the United States' interventionist approach to foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. Now, his critics might argue that despite these problems, this primacist grand strategy has been necessary to secure our national interests in a dangerous anarchic world. They'd also argue that we've frequently been forced to choose among a host of imperfect options and to follow the least bad one when no good options have existed. However, this is simply not the case. The grand strategy we've chosen to follow hasn't been dictated to us by the exigencies of the international system or the demands of our fundamental national interests. Instead, we've been fighting unnecessary wars and making unnecessary commitments that have cost us greatly in terms of blood and treasure while failing to make us more secure. Indeed, our interventions have often made us worse off and also have made others who are ostensibly trying to help worse off. And these commitments we've made threaten even greater trouble ahead. So let me tell you why primacy and interventionism, or liberal hegemonialism, as Steve put it, are unnecessary from a realist perspective. First, America is blessed with an almost ideal geostrategic position in the world. It's separated from other great powers by two large oceans that make it extremely difficult for states to project power into the Western Hemisphere. We also benefit from friendly neighbors that are relatively small in terms of population and militarily weak. Now, I might think very differently about U.S. grand strategy if we were bordered by or even close to other great powers, but we aren't, and this matters. We simply don't face the same geostrategic challenges as other great powers have faced in history. And a continent-sized superpower like us in our situation today certainly shouldn't think or act like we are a small state surrounded on all sides by enemies. This siege mentality is unnecessary. Second, the U.S. has a robust nuclear deterrent capability with a secure second strike. The nuclear revolution allowed us to reduce reliance on conventional forces and international activism to deter attack on our homeland by other state actors. So nuclear weapons may or may not end the era of geopolitics, but it's certainly a game changer, and we can't forget this when we think about what kind of defense policy is necessary to protect us. Third, in the unlikely event that deterrence fails, the U.S. maintains the world's strongest Navy and Air Force, which assures dominance at sea, in the air, and in space. And even in a non-nuclear world, could we really imagine a Chinese or a Russian or Iranian armada threatening our shores? It's very unlikely. It's, in fact, fanciful. Fourth, the balance of power in other areas of the world favors us. States tend to balance powerful or threatening states. Now, assuming they aren't allowed to free or cheap ride, as Barry Posen puts it, on American power, do we really think that potential regional hegemons in various parts of the world won't face the same type of balancing actions that we've seen repeated throughout history? So even assuming that China, Russia, Iran, or any other state could actually go for hegemony, despite their many economic and political constraints, they'd be confronted by a counterbalancing coalition of states. And rich countries like Japan and South Korea no more want to be ruled by China, say, than we do. And they have the incentive to do what is necessary to prevent that from happening. Ditto for rich European states like Germany and France, and balancing isn't foreign to Middle Eastern states either. Fifth, as the aforementioned Barry Posen has argued, the power of nationalism works in our favor. So even if a powerful state could militarily conquer another, as we did in Iraq, nationalism and religio-ethno differences make it difficult to hold on to foreign places without great costs. 6, humanitarian crises in non-democratic or illiberal regimes do not automatically threaten U.S. interest. There is no seamless web of interests or fragile global order that will be torn asunder if we don't intervene to stop bad things happening in faraway places. These are horrible things in many cases, but that doesn't necessarily harm U.S. interests. 7th, primacy isn't necessary to deal with anti-American non-state actors either, like terrorist groups. In fact, primacy with its greater global activism and larger overseas footprint may be a contributing factor to the problems other peoples have with us, and that Steve mentioned. And when confronted by anti-American terrorist organizations, there are better ways than large footprint military operations. Robust intelligence and police work is critical, as would be special operations forces, or even the use of regular forces with or without temporary partner states will do the trick in many cases. So if the current approach has as many problems as Steve argues, and it is as unnecessary as I say it is, what should our grand strategy be? Well, I think that the U.S. can safely pursue a strategy of restraint, the name that Eugene and his co-authors gave to a very traditional American foreign policy that would avoid the kinds of foreign entanglements that our founding fathers warned us against. So what is a grand strategy of restraint, for those of you who don't or have not heard of it? A grand strategy of restraint has two main components. The first is strategic independence, and the second is a prudential skepticism towards military intervention abroad. Strategic independence primarily means avoiding permanent peacetime military alliances. This will ensure that the United States can conduct its foreign policy with maximal flexibility, maintain impartiality towards other states and their actions, and stay out of foreign disputes and costly wars that are not related to our vital interests. Now, of course, this aspect of restraint does not rule out temporary wartime coalitions like the one that formed in World War II. Strategic independence also shifts the burden of defending other nations from our military to theirs. I'd rather see foreigners defending their countries and paying for it than our military and our taxpayers. And in the absence of a U.S. security commitment, these states will make reasonable decisions about their security and make appropriate trade-offs. The second component of restraint consists of a healthy dose of skepticism about using force abroad. Basically, defense and deterrence will be the primary methods of meeting U.S. security needs under restraint. Now, this does not mean that we would never use military power abroad, but it does mean that any military action should be focused on defending our vital interests, especially our territorial integrity, from clear and present dangers. and this would include taking action against terrorist groups that are planning or conducting specific operations against the U.S. homeland. But we should be quite skeptical of those who would advocate the use of force as the best way to handle problems in the world, especially those unconnected or only tangentially connected to our national interests. And then last, let me conclude by talking a little bit about some of the benefits of restraint. And there are a lot of benefits, but let me just list a few. First of all, it will cost us less blood and treasure. The Iraq War, for example, caused 4,491 U.S. deaths. Foolish wars such as this would stop under restraint. We'd also be able to save trillions of dollars on such wars while cutting the defense budget so that we can fund other priorities, or return money to the private sphere where it is more productive. And we should remember that the foundation of security is economic strength, and big $600 billion defense budgets undermine that foundation. A second benefit is there is a morality to a realistic foreign policy, and oftentimes critics say that it's amoral or immoral Machiavellianism, but I would argue there's a morality to it. The state acts justly when it serves its citizens' interests and is limited to providing a small set of public goods. Restraint is also moral because it minimizes the unintended consequences our actions foist on others whom we are ostensibly trying to help. And a state with an expansive foreign policy can do a great deal of harm in the world, even if its motives are pure. Witness the death and destruction we caused in Iraq and Vietnam. And then lastly, a limited realistic foreign policy is much less likely to require means that threaten the purpose of having government in the first place. Given that war is the health of the state, primacy in the quest for security may actually mean less security, more civil liberty violations, and the crushing burden of debt and taxes. So that's my brief for restraint.
Thanks very much, Will. And I neglected to mention in introducing Will, by the way, that he's also an Afghanistan war veteran. So, Eugene.
Thanks. Well, maybe thanks. There we go. So Steve and Will have done a terrific job of laying out problems of the current strategy and an alternative. Leaves me questioning a little bit. You know, I've been kind of editing my remarks as they speak a little bit. So I was kind of asked to talk about practical implementation, and I don't actually want to talk too much about practical implementation. It's pretty straightforward and obvious. So I'll say a few quick words about that and then try to add a little bit at the edge of some principles of restraint that I think are maybe belong as part of our conversation. So both Steve and Will have kind of indicated one of the advantages of restraint is you can cut the defense budget, the peacetime defense budget is less, and then also on top of that, you don't bear the expense in blood and treasure of fighting quite as many wars, and we have other uses for that money, whether it's giving it back to the American people or investing in other domestic concerns. I think that's obviously true, right? Cutting the budget is a very important benefit of restraint. In the original article many, many years ago, we sort of proposed as a rule of thumb idea, you could sort of cut the budget quite substantially, you know, maybe in half or something like that, and then see where we are and update. You know, right? We would get some more information. It's very hard to say. Like I would be challenged. I could propose a detailed force structure and try to cost it out and try to think of a budget for restraint right now and come up with an exact number for you. But I think actually part of the principle of restraint is there's a lot of things that are hard to predict about the future, and trying to figure out exactly what the right force structure and right budget is in advance given the world as it evolves. This is actually something that leads you seductively into the idea that you should try to control that future and builds the pressure for the big defense enterprise. And so I don't want to be tied particularly to a specific thing, to a specific force structure or budget, but just to say we could afford to start with a quite radical cut by the standards that we've had thus far, And then, because there's a fair amount of slack or cushion in the world, like things don't change on a dime, we would have a chance to update and evolve and see how we're going, and maybe we could cut further, maybe we'd have to cut a little less, but it would put us in the ballpark of understanding, which would be very important. Similarly, in terms of the kinds of forces, I think we can make rough decisions, we can have principles of what's appropriate to support restraint, but again, restraint is not put your head in the sand, stop watching the world and stop thinking, right? We would continue to evolve and understand, but I think it's fairly clear that restraint would lead to, as Will kind of said, more reliance on naval and air and space assets relative to ground assets, right? So we've cut the Army a little bit, and if you look at recent statements, strategic guidance from the Department of Defense, it's actually, they talk about cutting the Army size, but they're very hazy about why we should choose any particular size of the Army. Is the remaining size right? Well, we know that if we cut further, that would be bad, but why did we pick the size that we're picking? It's hard to justify. It's hard to find the right floor for the Army. So I would suggest we should start with a fairly significant cut, see where it gets us, understanding that we're not going to be under restraint in the business of large occupations that require high force to population or force to space ratios in other countries. We're not, there's no Army that's coming to face us where we are at home. Large footprints are not useful. So we would expect a much stronger cut to the forces that we can't think of a reason why they're useful than the forces where it's more ready to see why the Navy, even under our strategy of restraint, no one suggests that US strategy should not evolve command of the commons or protecting the commons, the open ocean, having what the strategy of restraint says we should back off of is other people's coasts, right? We don't have to provide the Coast Guard for China or the Coast Guard for Iran. They can have the Coast Guards for those, and they're, of course, the bad folks, right? We clearly don't care to provide the Coast Guard for our friends. France can have its own Coast Guard. But we do still want to do the much cheaper thing. We still have a much less aggressive force posture that would involve a Navy that patrols the blue water ocean. So we could still participate in world order under restraint, just with a very different emphasis in our force structure and emphasis on in our spending. So the trouble with entering up close and personal with other countries, and here's the kind of shift into what I think is the bigger principal issue as opposed to, the relative details of, okay, more Navy, less Army, cut the budget in half, see where we are. I think the goal of restraint really is right now, the current habits of international security for both the United States and other countries suggest that any incident anywhere in the world, the first question you ask is, where's the United States on this? Right? People in other countries actually overwhelmingly believe, if you poll them, that what's happening with their domestic government reflects the machinations of the United States. Right? Who's up, who's down. This is actually very bad for the United States. Our strategy plays into the wild conspiracy theories of all other countries around the world. It means they blame us for their problems, right? And of course, we walk into it because if something bad happens, we start to think about, well, how do we have to react to this problem wherever it is? The goal of restraint should be to change that habit for both them and for us, right? So we should prioritize. We should think about, does this outcome in this other country have bearing on actual US national interest, as opposed to starting from the principle of, if it happens, it must matter to us. And the key thing is to get out of thinking that about situations where we, previous to the event, knew very little about it. Right? That suggests it probably is not that related to our national interest, and also that if we engage in reacting to this situation, we're likely to screw it up, right? We don't understand all the detailed machinations of politics in countries around the world, especially countries we don't routinely pay a lot of attention to. Frankly, we don't understand the detailed machinations of our own politics, right? So Mitt Romney thought he was going to win on election day, right? If we can't understand our own, where we grew up with it and we know the culture, we should be very hesitant to think we really could muck around productively in somebody else's politics. And then we should also consider the cost of it. So the main core of restraint, I would say, is, I of course like much of what has already been offered, and the phrases about strategic independence and skepticism of intervention are very, very promising. But I think in a more practical sense, even if that could be pretty practical, the goal should be make it clear that local problems around the world are not our problems first, right? That's what restraint is about. It's, this is your problem. We might want to help at some point if it became our problem, but you are not us. And then the second thing is watch and learn. Right? There are a few occasions in the world where a stitch in time saves 9 or whatever it would be. We've got a bunch of cliches about how it's a good idea to act first and then ask questions later. But in general, that's not the case, right? So we can spend some time, because of the geography and our strategic position and all of these things. Restraint does not mean turn off intelligence, right? Watch. So maybe China will develop into a problem in an aggressive country over the course of the next 40 years. We should not have our head in the sand, fail to watch that, and fail to adjust if it's appropriate. But we don't have to act now. We can watch, learn, and see how that affects the United States. The same thing is true about, sure, we should be watching what happens with the Islamic State, or what happens with the potential for genocide in far-off places around the world. We can watch and react. And that is part of, these are your problems, we're still watching them, right? That's the principle of restraint.
Thank you very much, Eugene. I think we had 3 very thoughtful presentations. Let me perhaps start our discussion actually by challenging the 3 of you a little bit, actually on an implementation question. Now, people who take the other point of view, that the United States needs to be more interventionist. People who take that point of view would argue, and indeed have argued in the last few years, that when the United States is less interventionist, that this emboldens our enemies. It makes the world actually more dangerous for the United States, because our enemies are those who wish us ill. They look at our relative restraint and believe that this gives them perhaps license to do more, and boy, then they'll really come after us. We've certainly seen this in the debate about Syria. We've seen it in the debate about Russia and Ukraine. How would each of the 3 of you respond briefly to that argument?
I'll take the first swing at it. First of all, the idea that the United States has been acting with enormous restraint would be news to other people in other parts of the world. In the last 20 years.
This is, again, the question of making sense of our domestic debates.
No, it's just even the Obama administration, escalated the war in Afghanistan, escalated the use of drones and extrajudicial killings, intervened in Libya to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi, a decision that I believe President Obama probably regrets at this point. But the idea that the United States suddenly retreated to Fortress America at some point since the end of the Cold War would be laughable if you said that anywhere else in the world. And therefore, the idea that it is American restraint that's emboldening our adversaries is a talking point and nothing more. It just bears no resemblance to reality. In fact, if you look at the places that people have taken swings at the United States, it's because it's been in response to things we've been doing in their neighborhoods. right? It's not that they're upset with our tax policy. It's not that they're upset about the pension crisis in Chicago. They're upset about the fact that the United States has been doing various things in places like the Persian Gulf or Central Asia or other parts of the world. One could debate about whether or not those things we've been doing are the right things or not. Obviously, this panel thinks they were the wrong things. But the idea that somehow it's American timidity that is causing bad people to come after us, I think is just sort of laughable on its face. I'll stop there and let others take a swing.
Will or Dean?
Yeah, I'll be brief. You know, people's actions around the world aren't always motivated by looking at us. You know, it's a kind of hubris on our part to think that what these little local problems are, oh, it's because of the United States or because of what we're not doing. I mean, they have serious interests too. They get a vote, and I think that's really important. The other thing is that, and when it comes to regional order, let's say, it's still a question if other states are doing problematic things, who should promote that regional order? And as long as we're allowing states to free or cheap ride, then they're going to leave it to others. And one thing about having this step back from global activism is that others will pick up this burden because they have an incentive to do so. And I think that's appropriate. And they'll probably do it better, given that they face different trade-offs and a much more kind of attuned sensibility to it going badly than we do.
Eugene.
So I guess, again, the thing that I'll chip into this is the question also presupposes that we have a certain set of implacable enemies around the world and that we know who they are. There are people we don't like. There are people whose government systems we don't like. Actually, one of the great problems with the current strategy is that we feel obliged to make friends or work with repugnant regimes in other countries, right? So restraint actually would give us more choice about who we think our friends are. But liberal hegemony as a policy has certainly a much greater potential to create the self-fulfilling prophecy of adversaries for the United States, right? So it's not obvious that China implacably hates the United States and seeks to overthrow our government today, right? Now, maybe that's true, and it's just a matter of China building up sufficient resources such that they're ready to launch a Soviet-style Cold War or, you know, a swim across the Pacific or whatever it would be to come get us. But if we go and, through liberal hegemony, constantly push against them and tell them, we want to change your regime, we want to force you to participate in a certain style of international order, we almost certainly make it the case that China will be mad at us and will want to come for us if they can, right? So I don't know, maybe our weakness, if we were weak, which of course we're not, would embolden them. But it's also equally plausible that our pressing emboldens them, or at least angers them and makes their emboldening relevant.
All right, thanks very much. Well, I think we've got just a little bit more than 15 minutes left. Perhaps we should open it up for questions from the floor. If I could ask each of you, when you do ask a question, please to identify yourself for all of us up here. And also, if I could ask our panelists to exercise restraint in their answers so that we can have the maximum possible number of questions. I think there was one over here. Yes. Yeah.
Steve, I just wanted I've got a booming voice.
It's for the camera.
I just wanted to push back on Steve's laughable comment about U.S. restraint during the Obama administration. I think certainly on the fringes of the American order in Eastern Europe, Poland, and the Baltics, and the sort of traditional Sunni allies in the Gulf, I think they would absolutely say, and indeed in the case of Eastern Europe, have been saying since '09 in the Russian reset, that the U.S. has withdrawn its security guarantees, whether implicit or explicit, and hence that has emboldened their enemies and has put their security in greater peril. So I would offer it's not laughable at all.
I think our allies, or in some cases our client states, our protectorates, often tell us things like that. They constantly complain about American credibility. They've been doing it for 40 or 50 years. And as soon as some of these countries start spending, 3, 4, 5% of their GDP on defense, I'll be convinced that they really do have security fears and they really don't trust us. The fact that the Saudis complain, that's what I would do if I were the Saudis. I would complain constantly that the United States was not doing enough to protect them. But the point is, we should be making our own judgments about what we think our interests are and not necessarily be fooled by the various pleas that allies make for more protection.
And are you not concerned that their follow-on security choices are less beneficial to our interests than a U.S. security?
I haven't seen any of them realigning yet. Right? And if they did, I mean, to be really blunt about it, first of all, the Obama administration has reaffirmed security guarantees to all of the NATO members in Eastern Europe and has done a variety of things to try and head off the concerns you're pointing to. But secondly, the United States security would ultimately not be affected very much, if at all, if, say, Latvia was no longer part of the American security umbrella. It's really hard to argue how Latvia's realignment, and I'm not advocating it, I'm not saying the Lats should do that. I'm just saying if they did, it's hard to argue how people in Kentucky or California or New Jersey or Alaska would find their security or well-being substantially affected.
Why don't we move on? Ma'am, right in the center here.
My name's Jo Freeman, and I have been watching foreign policy for a good 50 years. During the Cold War period, we fought a lot of proxy wars in which we provided the munitions and the host country, or one of them, provided the troops. How would that fit within your policy of restraint? Would restraint only apply to our providing troops, or would it also apply to our providing munitions?
I think it would be quite straightforward that we would expect fewer proxy wars. I mean, who are we competing with, right? I mean, it's in the Cold War, there was an adversary, there was a view, maybe exaggerated at sometimes, that picking up chits around the world was strengthening one side's power against the other. We're not in that situation today, so we'd be less compelled to provide such support. Now, would that prevent arms sales? I wouldn't think, if other people were buying through legitimate international commerce. If Japan wanted to be our friend but not our ally and buy weapons from us, would we refuse to sell? I wouldn't think, but that's not what I think you mean by proxy wars.
Yeah. So I'll just give one example of something that we wouldn't do under a policy of restraint that we did do under the policy of containment and containment plus, the Reagan doctrine, which is Angola. Under a policy of restraint, there would be no need for us to get engaged in a dispute between different groups to dominate Angola. That just wouldn't be within it would be the kind of local problem that we would say, this is up for you to decide. And then you see where, you let the chips fly where they will, especially because, I mean, if Latvia doesn't matter, certainly there are other parts of the globe that are even less desirable for us to to intervene in, and that'll be actually good for them. This isn't merely just an argument about America's security interests. It's also that the well-being of others is oftentimes harmed, as you said, by us getting engaged in these things, and this will maybe temper some of those difficulties abroad.
This is also a really good example, the Angola one. I'm not a deep expert on Angola, right? But there were basically 3 different groups fighting and competing in Angola. These were some really nasty people, some of them. So when I was talking about the current strategy forcing us to align with countries that we might not like, that certainly happened in Angola, right? It was sort of Maoists competing with more traditional, Stalinist type. Like, why were we signing up with one of these against the other?
Yeah, just very quickly. I don't think restrainers would completely rule this out as a possible, but we'd be very leery of it for a couple of reasons. Just recognizing that this is a very crude instrument and it does have unintended consequences. So many people argue that our support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan was critical to helping bring down the Soviet Empire, but it also was critical in the emergence of Al-Qaeda and creating problems down the road. So we'd want to be fairly leery of that. I would also note, in recent years, we don't seem to be particularly good at picking clients to support. We provide enormous amounts of military aid and assistance to various clients, and either they misbehave in ways that complicate things, or, as we've seen in Iraq recently, they don't fight particularly well.
Let's take these two gentlemen on the left. Why don't we just take both of them together, first in front and then behind, and then we'll come to the other side.
Henry Hedger, retired government researcher at National Archives. You really haven't talked about another important issue, and that's finance. If you go back like World War I, World War II, the government had a completely different definition of fighting a conflict or involvement in a conflict even before we're fighting, and that is the finance issue. So they had to come up with a plan. They called it cash and carry. And they requested that a government that we were assisting to pay for any military aid or food aid or whatever aid they received in advance. So that was done. They also, once they couldn't afford, they provided a lend-lease type of arrangement. And of course, Britain owed us a great deal of money, and very recently, in the last 5 years or so, they finally paid off the entire bill, which is good. However, in recent years, we're now 18 trillion in debt. They've dropped this method of doing business. And I wondered if there's a need to improve on the way this is done. If a nation can afford to pay, say Iraq, they say Iraq is broke, but I'm not sure that they are. They have an enormous quantity of oil. Afghanistan is a poor nation, but how much aid can we supply?
I don't want to cut you off, but just we have multiple people wanting to ask questions. Let's perhaps combine this one and the gentleman seated right in front of you there, and then get responses from all three of our panelists.
Marion Smith, Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. This is a really important conversation, and I'm very happy to be invited and be able to participate. I think it hits on a feeling among a lot of Americans that our foreign policy doesn't necessarily serve us. Somehow, maybe we serve our foreign policy. And I'm also concerned that for folks of my age, a lot of our knowledge about foreign policy is governed by what we've seen in the Middle East. But there's a lot of history to U.S. foreign policy. And in terms of, I think you said, being sort of Coast Guard for international maritime borders and other actors, it strikes me that we did that very early on in the early 1800s, but it was very close to home. So my question for you is, if nature abhors a vacuum, in terms of a global, maritime police power, you basically had the Spanish, and then the Dutch, and then the British, and then a competition between whether or not it would be the U.S. or the Soviets. And now we're in maybe another order, right? And there's obviously gaps, but in a sort of grand view of history, those are the players that set a lot of the trade rules. And so I just wonder, is that a wrong way to view it? Does restraint, as you're laying it out, does it basically say that there's a greater risk to trying to fill vacuums that emerge? And should we tolerate or at least wait to see what happens in certain places, even if things seem to be going very badly for a few years?
Eugene, maybe it would make sense for you to respond to this question, since I think the Coast Guard comment was your comment, and then perhaps Will and Steve, we could ask you to respond to the question about financing.
I mean, the Coast Guard comment was about other countries' coasts, right? So I think if you think about the intersection between geography and technology today with respect to military force, there's a big increment of cost in approaching people's coasts, right? And so Restraint would say, I've never heard anyone who advocates Restraint not say, we should do the relatively low cost, general blue ocean kind of activities that you were talking about when you were pointing to the history of the British or the United States after the British. I mean, the Soviets, again, they didn't actually come out to try to provide global maritime support. They made it costly for the United States to approach their coast. And so I think this is one of those other great cliches, nature abhors a vacuum. Sometimes it will apply and sometimes it won't, but I don't think we want to try for a vacuum in the open ocean, right? It's near other people's coasts where technology has essentially created a military no man's land. It's much more costly for the United States to approach the coast of China or to approach the coast of Iran than it used to be, but that does not mean that it's not impossibly costly for China to go outside from their coast to build a blue water navy or whatever it would be.
Can I have just a quick follow-up?
You know, I'd really like to give others actually an opportunity. So if we could have Will and Steve just respond on the financing, and then we'll try to take one or two more questions before then.
Well, I just want to quickly comment on the vacuum one, actually, which is that we should welcome some burden sharing for regional order. I mean, it's unnatural for a state to try to provide a global order like this. Even some of those empires you were talking about, yes, in terms of the blue water aspects, they were providing a more global order, but not on land the way we've been trying to. So I would think that this is unnatural, and we should go back to a more natural order of sharing, especially in Europe, where we have really rich, really populous states that combined under the EU could certainly defend themselves against essentially a third world country with nuclear weapons. And then the question is, what other threats might they face? Well, those are also things for which large footprint militaries probably don't really give a good answer. I mean, those are issues dealing with immigration and societal and domestic problems.
Steve.
Very quickly, the only way to run a big, ambitious strategy like liberal hegemony is to try and keep the costs as low as possible or to conceal them as much as possible. And that's essentially what we've done. We've deficit spent our way to running this empire. We've used the all-volunteer force, which keeps people from being drafted and therefore minimizes domestic opposition. We use supplemental budgets to go off and fight wars as well. And so it's why, Paul Wolfowitz told us that the Iraq War was going to pay for itself and that the Army Chief of Staff's estimates of the number of troops we were going to need were wildly off the mark. If you fess up what these things are going to cost in advance, the American people won't support them because the American people understand that actually the stakes for a lot of these things we're doing are really quite small. And on the question of the sort of global footprint and command of the commons and coast guards and things like that, if you want to maintain American command of the commons, the one thing you shouldn't be doing is squandering enormous amounts of wealth and treasure trying to run the local politics of countries in Central Asia or the Persian Gulf or any other part of the world, because we don't know how to do that, and that really costs a lot.
Okay, let's take one more. We're getting very close. Sir in the middle, right there with the yellow tie. And if I could encourage short question and short responses, and then we'll wrap up in time for everyone to have a timely lunch.
I'll make as short as I can. What would be the role of international organizations in a restrained environment where the U.S. has a restrained grand strategy? Because as it is now, it's clearly a product of liberal hegemony and all the institutions that were founded on the post-World War II. So how would a restrained foreign policy approach those international organizations?
Who'd like to go first?
Well, we might disagree a little bit among those. I actually think of many international institutions as effective tools of American power and other countries' power. Institutions don't have a lot of power in and of themselves, but they are tools that great powers can use to try and advance various measures and various agendas. And we've actually, I believe the United States has largely profited from having some effective institutions out there. And one of the things you see happening now, and it may have more effects on our overall global influence than some of the other things that we've discussed today, is a retreat from that kind of engagement as well, from essentially the diplomatic engagement where Congress won't, alter the IMF's monetary arrangements, where they won't refund the Export-Import Bank, and that may actually be ultimately undermining American global influence more than whether or not we're actually going to dictate the outcome in Western Anbar province or not.
Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree with you, Steve, actually. And I would add that I think when it comes to trade barrier reducing institutions, that these are also good things. So one important point to make about restraint, and Eugene touched on this a little bit, is that restrainers don't want to stick their heads in the sand like an ostrich. We don't want to disengage from the world. This is not Pat Buchananism in the sense of trade policy or engagement with the world. It is that we would like to engage the world economically in a robust fashion. I think diplomatically and culturally it's important that the United States engage the world. There's a lot that we can learn from the world. There's a lot of great things out there. We should encourage individuals and nonprofits to be diplomats for the American liberal values. So that's wonderful. It's the security regimes that are more problematic because it costs us in terms of the burden gets shifted back to us, but also that we become impartial, as George Washington said, towards people, and we start to make bad decisions based not on our interests, but on those commitments. And the commitments should serve the interests, not the other way around. So I think that's really important. So this is not isolationism as its enemies would put it, because in many ways isolationism was never that stick your head in the sand. But even if it were, that's not what restraint is all about.
All right. Well, I'm told that I have a little bit of time to ask one question myself, so I'd like to ask one question of the three of you, and I'll try to be brief and again to ask for brief responses. How much of our challenge as a nation in these debates do you think is really a result of our understanding of history, or perhaps even our lack of understanding of history? And I'll just give one example. There are a lot of examples. Certainly people talk about World War I, World War II, Vietnam all the time. But let me go a little bit farther back. As I look at American history, here's a country, the country that we live in, which exists actually in no small part because the British needed to raise taxes on the colonies and couldn't raise them domestically in the mother country. Because of a war that they pursued here actually with the French. And when they faced a rebellion in the colonies, they quickly found that the majority of the British military was actually stuck in India, protecting that very valuable province. The commanders here were constantly asking for more troops and never getting them. And the naval commanders who were trying to blockade the United States were never getting as many ships as they wanted, actually because the British Navy was protecting the much more valuable sugar trade from the Caribbean. Do you think that there are any lessons perhaps in our own history for us to think about? And I'm sorry for a kind of a leading question, but I'll ask it anyway.
Sure. I mean, of course there are lessons in our history, or in this case, lessons in global history, right? Somebody else who was trying to provide, who faced trade-offs among global interests and didn't want to recognize them and ended up losing the colonies as a result. Sure, there are lessons to be drawn from that. There are many lessons. It's important to study history. I would hesitate, though, to go too far in this direction, right? I mean, I think fundamentally we should study history and study our values, and we should think about past experience to help us learn what it is that we care about in our national interest, these kinds of things. But we shouldn't be tied to that. We should be tied to understanding the world today is actually quite different. Steve explained some ways that it has not gone so favorably in the last 20 years. But we're not in the Cold War, and we should understand principles from history, but not think that we need to shoehorn our understanding of our current interest and threats to those interests into our habits that we've developed from understanding or from thinking we understand our history, right? There's a tremendous momentum to decisions about strategy that come from people thinking, well, we're doing the same thing that we did in the past, and we have to be cautious, I think, about that.
I agree with what Eugene said, but just to talk about the historical examples, if we are going to use them, we need a broader array of historical examples than the ones that we have and oftentimes utilize in these public debates. I mean, basically, you would think that the only relevant things for America today are the lessons of the 1930s. And those may be anomalous cases. There are things to learn from the 1930s, but that's not the only set of examples. And so I'm glad you brought this other one about trade-offs, but there are so many great examples. And I mean, heck, we have recent ones, Iraq and Vietnam, that should caution us about getting involved in faraway struggles. And unfortunately, we keep making the same errors over and over again.
I'd be the last person to argue that we shouldn't try and learn a lot from history. Among other things, if you understood the history of how democracy has emerged and spread in the world, you would understand that you can't do it overnight, particularly in countries that are deeply divided where they have no democratic traditions. That's what the history of the last 400 years, I think, tells us. I think the other thing we ought to ask historically is, how did the United States get this very large, ambitious, grand strategy? It's a legacy from the Cold War, and one can defend the fact that we had to have this big sort of global approach to defeating communism, but in the course of pursuing that strategy, we also created an enormous set of institutions, the same set of institutions that Dwight D. Eisenhower, notorious pacifist, warned us against in his famous speech about the military-industrial complex as he was leaving office. And then all you have to do is look at the situation we have here in Washington today, where if you added up all the institutions that are basically in favor of extensive, ambitious global engagement, the strategy of liberal hegemony, and defend it tooth and nail, even though they may disagree about how to do that tactically, and the number of institutions and think tanks in Washington who are in favor of a more restrained foreign policy, there is an enormous imbalance of power between the former and the latter in terms of influence for the public mind. And so in a sense, there are two imbalances of power in the world today. One is the United States and the rest of the world, where we are still far stronger than anybody else is, which allows us to wander around and get into trouble, and this imbalance of power inside the Beltway between those who are in favor of wandering around the world and getting into trouble because it keeps them busy, and those who think maybe a more restrained approach would make more sense, would actually make us safer, richer, and in the end would also do a better job of preserving and expanding American values.
Well, thank you for participating in some balancing behavior in terms of the second one.
Exactly.
Paul, any last words?
No,
All right.
thank you.
Well, please join me in thanking our very distinguished panelists for a very stimulating conversation. So I mentioned that today's discussion is a first in a series on grand strategy. The next event we'll be hosting is July 14th, and the topic will be what are the lessons of Libya, and we do hope that you'll join us. Anything else you want me to add, Will? Nope. So I am actually the last thing standing between you and continuing this conversation over lunch. We do hope you'll join us. There is a buffet set up for you in the hallway. And thanks again to our panel.